When I unlocked the front door of my newly purchased cottage that Thursday afternoon, I expected silence. Instead, I heard the faint scrape of metal against wood coming from upstairs. At first, I assumed it was the wind nudging an old window frame. Then, I heard a woman's voice quietly reading measurements into her phone. 41 inches. Maybe custom shelving would fit here. I climbed the stairs as quietly as I could. Standing inside my bedroom was my daughter-in-law, Claire. She wasn't admiring the view or looking around out of curiosity. She was measuring my walk-in closet with a tape measure while recording dimensions on her phone, as if she had been hired to redesign the room. She never noticed me until I spoke. Claire. She spun around so suddenly that the tape measure slipped from her hand and clattered across the hardwood floor before sliding beneath the bed. "Oh," she exclaimed, forcing a smile. I folded my arms. What exactly are you doing in my bedroom?" She gave an awkward laugh. "I was just trying to imagine how everything could be arranged. Ethan said you hadn't decided what to do with the rooms yet." Her answer didn't explain why she was inside a locked house. I looked directly at her. "How did you get inside?" She hesitated for only a second. "Ethan has a key." The words hit harder than I expected. My son, Ethan, did not have a key, neither did my younger sister, neither did my closest friend. In fact, only one key existed, and it usually stayed inside the zippered compartment of my handbag. I kept my voice calm. I never gave Ethan one. Claire looked down before answering. He copied it. "From your purse a few weeks ago." For several long seconds, neither of us spoke. A month earlier, I had visited Ethan and his family for Sunday dinner. My handbag had been sitting near their front door while we ate without telling me my own son had taken my key, made a duplicate, returned the original, and never mentioned it. I suddenly understood why Claire looked more embarrassed than surprised. She knew it was wrong. "Please leave," I said quietly. She blinked. "What? I want you to leave my house right now." She stared at me, hoping I might change my mind. I didn't. After collecting her phone and retrieving the tape measure, she walked downstairs without another word. The front door closed behind her. Only then did I finally breathe. To understand why that moment hurt so deeply, you need to know who I am. My name is Margaret Lawson. I'm 64 years old and spent 32 years teaching English at a public middle school. I loved my students even on the difficult days. And after retiring, I promised myself something I had postponed for decades. I would finally buy a home chosen only for me. Not for school districts, not because it shortened someone's commute, not because it fit a growing family, just for me. After my husband passed away 6 years earlier, I stayed in our old family house longer than necessary because every room carried memories. His favorite chair still faced the living room window. The garage still held shelves he had built with his own hands. Even the faded curtains reminded me of happier years. But eventually, memories became heavier than comfort. I wanted a fresh beginning. Without telling anyone, I spent months searching for the perfect place until I found a charming cottage in the quiet town of Brookhaven, about 2 hours away. The house wasn't large. It had 3 bedrooms, a cozy fireplace, original oak floors, and a peaceful sunroom overlooking a beautiful maple tree that glowed crimson every autumn. The moment I stepped inside, I knew it belonged to me. I signed the papers without discussing the decision with anyone. Only after everything was finalized did I call Ethan. Instead of congratulating me, he sounded offended. "You bought a house without telling us. I wanted it to be a surprise." "A surprise? Mom, we're your family." "I know. You should have asked what we thought." That sentence stayed with me. Asked. I had worked my entire adult life, paid every mortgage payment, saved every dollar, raised Ethan after his father became too ill to work. Why did I need permission to spend my own retirement savings? Over the following weeks, our conversations became increasingly uncomfortable. Ethan kept mentioning how crowded his own house had become. Claire's mother had moved in temporarily. The children were sharing a bedroom. Parking was difficult. Traffic was exhausting. Little by little, every discussion somehow returned to my new cottage. At first, I thought he simply admired it. I had no idea he was already imagining it as his family's future home, and I certainly never imagined he had already made himself a key. The first hint that Ethan's interest in my cottage wasn't innocent came during a phone call a few days later. He asked about the spare bedrooms. How many are there? He said casually. 2. And you're planning to use both? I smiled to myself. I'll have one as a guest room and the other as a reading room. There was a brief silence. You don't really need a reading room? I laughed softly. I've waited over 40 years to have one. He didn't laugh back. Over the next 3 weeks, every conversation somehow circled back to the house. Sometimes he asked whether the backyard was fenced. Other times he wanted to know if the basement could be renovated or whether the kitchen had enough space for a larger dining table. The questions became strangely specific. One evening he finally stopped hinting. He began carefully. Brookhaven is almost halfway between my office and the new regional branch, so it would make life a lot easier. For whom? Our family. I remained quiet. He continued. The kids could finally have separate bedrooms. Claire's mother wouldn't have to sleep in the den anymore. The yard sounds perfect. I already knew where the conversation was heading. Ethan, what? This isn't your house. I'm just saying it makes more sense for a family than for one person. I took a slow breath. It makes perfect sense for the person who bought it. He sighed loudly. Mom, you're 64. Yes, living alone 2 hours away isn't practical. I've been taking care of myself for decades. I just think you're making a mistake. No, I answered calmly. I think you're imagining a future that doesn't belong to you. The conversation ended shortly afterward. For the next week, neither of us called. I focused on moving. Each trip to Brookhaven made the cottage feel more like home. I unpacked boxes one at a time instead of rushing. I hung family photographs in the hallway, placed my favorite novels inside the built-in bookshelves, and spread my grandmother's handmade quilt across the bed. For the first time in years, every decision belonged only to me. Then came Friday. I had packed my car with more belongings, planning to spend the entire weekend settling in. As I turned onto my street, my heart sank. A dark blue SUV sat in my driveway. Ethan's. I parked at the curb and stared for several seconds before stepping out. Laughter drifted through the open kitchen window. When I entered the house, I froze. The refrigerator door stood open while Ethan filled its shelves with groceries. Claire arranged blankets in the living room. Their 2 children raced through the hallway, shouting excitedly. Claire's older sister was standing in the sunroom discussing where a television might fit. Several sleeping bags had already been unrolled on my floor. Everyone looked completely comfortable, so as though they belonged there. Ethan smiled when he noticed me. There you are. I didn't answer. We thought we'd surprise you, he continued cheerfully. The kids were excited to help unpack. I slowly placed my purse on the kitchen counter. How long have you been here? About an hour. How long are you staying? The whole weekend. He answered so naturally that it sounded as if we'd discussed the plan together. Hola! We brought food, Claire added brightly. That way you wouldn't have to cook. I looked around the room. Cabinets were already open. Kitchen drawers had been reorganized. Someone had moved several unopened boxes into different rooms without asking me. My carefully planned weekend had disappeared before I even arrived. I walked into the sunroom. Claire's sister smiled politely. This space gets beautiful afternoon light, she said. It would make an amazing playroom. I looked around the room. Large windows overlooked the maple tree. A comfortable chair would fit perfectly beside the glass. This isn't going to be a playroom, I said quietly. Claire frowned, assured that I was only making a suggestion. I've already decided what this room will be. An uncomfortable silence settled over the house. Back in the kitchen, Ethan closed the refrigerator. We're only trying to help. I never asked for help. We're family, I know. Then why are you acting like we're strangers? I met his eyes. Because strangers usually knock before entering someone else's home. His smile disappeared. Neither of us spoke for several moments. Finally, I took a slow breath. Ethan, what? I want all of you to leave. The room became completely silent. Even the children stopped talking in the hallway. Claire stared at me in disbelief. You can't be serious. I've never been more serious. We drove 2 hours. I understand. The kids were looking forward to this. I'm sorry. Ethan folded his arms. So you're throwing your own family out. I nodded once. This is my home, not yours. His expression hardened. At that moment, I realized this argument had never really been about a weekend visit. It was about ownership, and I had no intention of surrendering mine. For a few seconds, no one moved. The children looked back and forth between their parents, confused by the silence. Claire's sister quietly stepped away from the sunroom doorway, sensing she had wandered into a family dispute that had nothing to do with, her. Ethan stared at me as though he expected me to apologize. Instead, I stood my ground. You really want us to pack everything up and leave? He asked. Yes. After we drove all this way? Yes, Claire folded her arms. This is unbelievable. I don't think it is, I replied. What I find unbelievable is that all of you entered my home without permission. We had a key, Ethan argued. A key you had no right to make. He looked away. For the first time since I arrived, he had no answer. Without another word, Claire began stuffing groceries back into reusable bags. Ethan rolled up the sleeping bags while the children quietly collected their toys. No one argued anymore. The excitement that had filled the house only minutes earlier had vanished, replaced by an uncomfortable silence. Before leaving, Ethan stopped at the front door. You've changed. I looked at him sadly. No, Ethan, I finally started protecting what belongs to me. He shook his head, gathered the last bag, and walked outside. I watched from the front window as the SUV backed slowly down the driveway before disappearing around the corner. Only after it was gone did the house finally feel like mine again. The silence that followed wasn't lonely. It was peaceful. I carried my remaining boxes inside one by one. There was no rush, no one telling me where furniture should go or how a room ought to be used. That evening, I made the simplest dinner imaginable: scrambled eggs, buttered toast, and hot tea. Sitting alone at the small kitchen table, I listened to the sounds outside. A dog barked somewhere in the distance. Leaves rustled gently against the windows. A train whistle echoed from the miles away. For the first time in years, I felt completely at ease. The next morning, I called a locksmith. By noon, every exterior lock had been replaced. The front door, the back entrance, even the old side door leading into the sunroom. When the locksmith handed me 2 new keys, I slipped one into my purse and locked the other inside a small safe at home. No one else would ever have access again unless I personally chose to give it. Later that afternoon, I called my younger sister, Helen. She listened quietly as I explained everything from the copied key to finding Claire, measuring my closet, and finally, the surprise family weekend. When I finished, she sighed. I wondered if something like this might happen. You did? I've noticed how often Ethan talks about your cottage. It stopped sounding like admiration weeks ago. I leaned back in my chair. I don't understand where this came from. Helen's voice softened. You've always helped him, Maggie. She was right. Over the years, I had paid the deposit on Ethan's first apartment when he couldn't afford it. I had co-signed his first car loan. When he and Claire bought their house, I quietly contributed $40,000 toward their down payment. I never expected repayment. I never mentioned the money again. Helping my son had always brought me happiness, but somewhere along the way, generosity had slowly become expectation. Perhaps without realizing it, Ethan had started believing that everything I owned would eventually become available whenever he needed it. My cottage was simply the latest example. Helen interrupted my thoughts. Oisa, so what are you going to do now? I've already changed the locks. Good. And I think I need legal advice. There was a brief silence. I think you're making the right decision, she replied. On Monday morning, I called the attorney who had handled my late husband's estate several years earlier. After listening carefully, she didn't sound shocked. In situations like this, she explained, it's important to document everything, even though he's my son, especially because he's family. She advised me to keep records of every incident, save text messages, and write down dates while they were still fresh in my memory. Then she said something that stayed with me. Love and legal boundaries can exist at the same time. Setting one doesn't erase the other. Those words lifted a weight from my shoulders. For days, I had questioned whether I was being cruel, and now I realized I wasn't punishing my son. I was protecting my peace. That evening, I sat in the sunroom with a cup of tea as the setting sun painted the maple tree in shades of gold and orange. The house was quiet. The rooms were exactly as I wanted them. For the first time since buying the cottage, I truly believed I had reclaimed something much greater than a home. I had reclaimed the right to decide how I wanted to live the rest of my life. The following week, my attorney prepared a formal letter addressed to Ethan. It wasn't filled with threats or accusations. Instead, it was clear, respectful, and impossible to misunderstand. The letter explained that my property was private, that no one was permitted to enter without my consent, and that any future unauthorized entry would be treated as trespassing regardless of family ties. I signed it without hesitation. When it
was mailed by certified post, I felt strangely calm. For the first time in weeks, I wasn't reacting to someone else's decisions. I was making my own. 3 days later, my phone rang. "Ethan," I answered after the third ring. "I got the letter," he said flatly. "I assumed you would. You actually hired a lawyer." "I asked for legal advice. You embarrassed me." I closed my eyes for a moment. "Ethan, you copied my house key without permission." "I was only trying to help." "You entered my home while I wasn't there." "We're family." "I know we are. Families don't send legal letters." I spoke quietly. Families also don't secretly duplicate keys and treat someone else's house as their own. Silence filled the line. When he finally spoke again, his voice had lost much of its anger. "So, what happens now?" "Now," I answered, "you call before visiting. If I say yes, you're welcome. If I say no, you respect my answer." He didn't respond. A few seconds later, the call ended. The rest of the summer passed peacefully. I settled into a comfortable routine. Every Saturday morning, I walked to the farmer's market, carrying a woven basket I had bought from a local artisan. The vendors soon learned my name. The elderly baker always saved a loaf of fresh sourdough for me. The flower seller insisted on adding a few extra daisies to every bouquet. The owner of the little bookstore recommended novels she thought I would enjoy. And before long, we were discussing literature over coffee every other week. For the first time in many years, I was building a life that belonged entirely to me. I painted the guest bedroom a soft cream color. I planted lavender along the stone pathway leading to the front porch. The reading room slowly filled with shelves of novels collected over a lifetime. Every evening, sunlight poured through the windows of the sunroom before fading into a peaceful twilight. No interruptions, no expectations, no explanations. One afternoon, while pulling weeds around the maple tree, I heard someone call my name. It was my neighbor Eleanor, who lived 2 houses away. She was in her early 70s and had moved to Brookhaven after losing her husband several years before. She rested her gardening gloves on the fence. "That maple is beautiful," she said. "I fell in love with it the first time I saw the house." She smiled knowingly. "Wait until October." "Is it even prettier?" she laughed. "The whole street turns golden. Every year I come outside with a cup of coffee just to watch the leaves change." Her words made me smile. "That sounds wonderful." "It is," she replied. "Peace is underrated." After she continued her walk, I stood quietly beneath the tree. Peace. That single word described everything I had been searching for without realizing it. For decades, my life had revolved around responsibilities, deadlines, bills, parent-teacher meetings, school concerts, doctor appointments, helping relatives, supporting my son whenever he stumbled. I had never regretted those years. They had shaped me. But somewhere along the journey, I had forgotten that I deserved peace too. Not because I had earned it, simply because every person deserves a place where they can breathe without guilt. As summer slowly gave way to autumn, Ethan stopped calling every week. The angry messages disappeared. The pressure disappeared. Even Claire remained silent. Perhaps they had finally understood that I wasn't changing my mind. Or perhaps they had accepted that my boundaries were real. Either way, life became wonderfully ordinary. Sometimes ordinary is exactly what happiness looks like. Then, near the end of September, my phone rang once again. It was Ethan. His voice sounded different this time. Calmer. "Mom." "Yes. I was wondering." He paused before finishing his sentence. "Would it be all right if I came by next weekend? Just me and the boys?" For a moment, I simply listened. It was the first time he had asked instead of assumed. The first time he had given me the opportunity to choose. A small smile crossed my face. Yes, I answered. I'd like that. There was another brief silence. Then, very softly, he said something I hadn't heard in months. Thank you. It wasn't an apology. Not yet. But it was the first genuine step toward becoming a family again. The following Saturday arrived with cool autumn air and a cloudless sky. I woke early, brewed a pot of coffee, and opened the windows of the sunroom. A gentle breeze carried the scent of fallen leaves through the house. Outside, the maple tree had begun its annual transformation. Its green leaves were slowly giving way to brilliant shades of amber and crimson, just as Eleanor had promised. Shortly before noon, I heard a car pull into the driveway. This time, it wasn't a surprise. Ethan had called 3 days earlier, asked politely if he could visit, and waited for my answer before making any plans. That simple act meant more to me than he probably realized. When I opened the front door, my 2 grandsons rushed forward with excited
smiles. Grandma? I hugged them tightly before looking up at Ethan. He stood quietly on the porch with his hands in his jacket pockets. I brought lunch, he said, holding up a paper bag from a local bakery. Come in. The boys immediately ran into the backyard, laughing as they chased one another across the grass. Their joyful voices filled the air without disturbing the peaceful feeling the house had given me since the day I moved in. Inside, Ethan carefully placed the food on the kitchen counter. He didn't open cabinets. He didn't rearrange anything. He simply waited. That alone told me he understood something had changed. We carried our coffee into the sunroom and sat facing the maple tree. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. Finally, Ethan broke the silence. I've had a lot of time to think. I looked at him, but said nothing. I was angry when you bought this place. I know. I convinced myself you were pushing us away. I wasn't. He nodded slowly. I see that now. The words were quiet, almost hesitant, but they sounded sincere. He looked around the room. I think somewhere along the way, I stopped seeing this as your home. I waited. I started thinking about how useful it could be for us. He sighed deeply. I never stopped to ask whether that's what you wanted. A long silence followed. Outside, the boys laughed as they tossed colorful leaves into the air. I've spent weeks trying to understand why I acted the way I did, Ethan continued. I don't think I even realized how entitled I sounded until you made me leave that weekend. I smiled gently. It wasn't easy for me either, I know. He rubbed his hands together. When I copied your key, I told myself it wasn't a big deal. It was. I know that now. For the first time since this began, he looked directly into my eyes. I'm sorry, Mom. There it was. Not an excuse, not a justification, just an apology. I reached across the table and rested my hand on his. I forgive you. His shoulders relaxed as though he had been carrying an invisible weight for months. I don't expect everything to go back to normal overnight, he admitted. It doesn't have to. I just want us to move forward. So do I. Later that afternoon, we all walked through the neighborhood together. The streets of Brookhaven were lined with glowing autumn trees, and children rode bicycles while neighbors chatted from their front porches. Eleanor waved as we passed. So, these must be the famous grandsons, she said with a smile. The boys proudly introduced themselves before racing ahead once again. Watching them run beneath the falling leaves, I realized something important. Setting boundaries hadn't destroyed my family. It had saved it. Without honesty, resentment would have continued growing until there was nothing left but anger. Instead, we had finally learned to respect one another. As the sun began to set, Ethan gathered the boys and prepared to leave. Before getting into his car, he turned back toward the cottage. It's a beautiful home, he said. I smiled. It really is, he nodded. I'm glad you found it. After they drove away, I remained on the front porch for several minutes. The evening breeze carried another shower of bright orange leaves across the yard. I wrapped my sweater a little tighter and looked at the maple tree glowing in the fading sunlight. 32 years of teaching, years of caring for my husband through illness, decades of raising a son, paying bills, keeping promises, and putting everyone else's needs ahead of my own. Those chapters had shaped my life, and I would never regret them, but this chapter belonged to me. Inside the cottage, my grandmother's quilt rested neatly across my bed. My books filled the shelves exactly as I had arranged them. The painting that had traveled with me through every move hung where the morning sun would find it each day. Everything around me reflected choices I had made for myself. I picked up my coffee, stepped into the quiet yard, and stood beneath the maple tree as another leaf drifted gently to the ground. For the first time in many years, I wasn't searching for peace. I was living in it.